really been facing a challenging time with the pandemic, and it's all been really built up. And the notion of decision making has been imperative. So now it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning psychologist, behavioral economist, and author of Thinking Fast and Slow, and Becky Anderson from CNN, to really detail how COVID really affected the way we evaluate risks, how we take decisions, and what is the process of sound decision making moving forward.
Well, thank you to the organisers of the World Government Summit and to all of you for spending your time with us today. I'm Becky Anderson, host of CNN's most expansive news show, Connect the World, which we broadcast from our Middle East broadcasting hub here in Abu Dhabi, where I also serve as the bureau chief and managing editor. I trust that you are all keeping well. Well, it's become more urgent and more pressing to me than ever to get our viewers the straight facts during the pandemic, the very latest and the very best guidance that the world has to offer in clear and simple terms. It can save lives and helps stop people from getting sick. For so many of us, the building blocks of everyday life, going to the office, hopping on a bus, hugging a friend, popping to the shops, vanished in an instant and have now morphed in almost every corner of the world into hugely complex decisions that verge on the existential and rely on complex medical, political, social and economic dimensions. It's a huge weight to carry. A recent study I saw cited by the World Economic Forum figure that 1 in 3 adults are depressed or anxious amid the pandemic. So, in a world where we are losing so much on a human, economic and social level, how can we adapt and make better decisions when we are all so loss averse? And that is where I'd like to begin my discussion with Nobel Prize winning economist Daniel Kahneman. Daniel's work has forever changed the world by uncovering and examining how we all actually think and how and why we make decisions. So it is a distinct honour to have you with us today and to speak to you. So thank you. In societies around the world, the pandemic has tilted the axis of our reality. Our thoughts towards our jobs, our money, our health, even our family have changed. How do you see and how would you describe that change in perception?
Well, obviously this is a completely new situation for all of us. It's unique. People are going to remember this year, I hope, as a unique year for the rest of their lives. And we've had to adapt to completely different circumstances in which we are much more isolated than we were, in which we are much more uncertain, and in many situations in which our trust in authorities and in that we should be trusting has been dented, I think, by the inconsistencies and by the uncertainty in the communication about the pandemic, which have been constant from the beginning. We just still know very little. A year into the pandemic, we know very little about what is happening and what are the threats, what are the dangers. And adapting our behavior to the threat is really quite difficult.
I mean, couples, families, and people in general who can work remotely have spent a huge amount of time at home this past year. Millions of us are no longer commuting, no longer socializing as much or visiting the office. How do you think that change of pace and scenery, as it were, is impacting our relationship with our families, with our partners, with the people that we work with, and ourselves?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that there isn't a single answer to this. There are some families that have been brought together more closely by being forced into the same space and the parents working at home. In many families has been very good for the children. In other families where there was tension to begin with, being cooped together in a space certainly has not been good for people. So we've seen, I think, there have been many reports of increased domestic violence, and at the same time, there are many people who have discovered the joys of a more relaxed way of working that they hadn't known before. So I'm very struck actually by the success of remote work. That is, just about everywhere that I've heard, people are extremely satisfied with the fact that there has been very little loss of productivity. In some cases, I've heard from friends that actually productivity has increased. At the same time, commutes have been eliminated. People are much freer to adjust their time. So there are some advantages. There are some big disadvantages as well. Those probably haven't been felt as much as they will be felt later. For example, integrating new people into the workforce and altogether creating new contacts. It turns out that maintaining old contacts remotely is feasible. But creating new contacts and creating new friendships and so on, that is probably much harder remotely than in person. And over time, this is going to have some effect.
Yeah, these reflections will resonate, I know, with many of those who are joining us today. Sir, your new book, Noise, explores what individuals, institutions, and organizations can do to make better decisions. One of the concepts you explore is decision hygiene. Talk me through what that means and how it can be used to make better decisions.
Okay. Well, the discussion about the quality of decision making has been over the last few decades dominated by the concept of bias. That is, people are supposed to be systematic, and people are systematically prone to errors, to predictable errors, and those are biases. In our recent work, we've emphasized another aspect, another kind of mistake that happens in organizations in particular, and this is that people who should be making similar judgments, like different doctors in the ER or different underwriters in an insurance company or different governments dealing with the same pandemic, are making very different decisions and are actually quite unreliable. So we've been emphasizing noise as a complement to bias. And decision hygiene, the term decision hygiene, it's intended to evoke the idea that when you are washing your hands, you really do not know which germs you're protecting yourself against. When you're washing your hands, you're protecting yourself against a lot of germs, a lot of different germs. You don't even have to know what they are. So this is quite different from dealing with biases, because when you deal with biases, you know what you're dealing with. When you're dealing with hygiene, when you apply rules of hygiene, you don't know what you're dealing with. So let me give you a few examples because it's very abstract. So there is an approach to problems that we know that the intuitive approach to problem has certain deficiencies. And applying your intuition in general exposes you to the following risk: that you're dealing with a problem, you quickly form an impression, and then you spend a lot of time confirming or looking for evidence that rationalizes and supports your first impression. This is something that happens in interviews, for example. When we interview someone, findings are that in the first 2 or 3 minutes, sometimes even the setup of the interview, when people are just creating rapport, creates an impression that dominates the rest of the interview. So a rule of hygiene is to keep on getting information and not to get locked into your early impressions, but to try to resist these early impressions and collect as many independent facts, and in group settings like in meetings, as many independent opinions as you can, and delaying intuition. So that's a really important rule of decision hygiene, that if you can delay intuition until you have the facts, your intuition is going to be better informed and more valid and more reliable. So that's several elements in which I've described. Yes.
How would you suggest that what you've just described might help organizations and governments make better decisions going forward, not least as they come out of this pandemic period?
Well, there are some general suggestions. A lot of decisions are made in organizations, are made in meetings. I mean, people spend their lives when there are high executives meeting other people. And I think there is general agreement that meetings are very inefficient. And in the designing principles of hygiene, we are considering what could be done to improve the quality of meetings, to improve the quality of decisions that are taken in meetings. And there are several very basic principles that can be applied. One of them is that you want as much diversity of opinions as possible. And one of the things that is happening in meetings typically is that the first people who speak have too much influence, and there is very rapid convergence in general in a well-functioning group. There is overly rapid convergence to consensus. And actually, what you would want to do in a meeting is to delay the phase of reaching conclusions, again, as I was saying earlier, as much as possible. And you would also want people to come into the meeting with opinions, that is, for people to form their independent opinions before they start the discussion, rather than as in the context of the discussion. Anything that improves independent impression formation and independent reaching of conclusions is going to improve the quality of decision.
Fascinating. You are an expert on human behavior, and so much of your work has been focused on improving decision making. I wonder how you would rate the world and its organizations, its governments and its organizations through this pandemic period. And is there anything different you think world leaders should be doing to better address the significant economic and social impact stemming from COVID-19?
Well, I think that it's been COVID, but at the same time, I'm very much under the influence of what happened in Texas a short while ago and what happened in California last summer. And when you look at the combination of the California fires, the Texas freezing, the pandemic, it turns out the major impression is that we are in a world that is prone to disasters and catastrophes to an extent that is probably greater than in the past, and that the kind of preparedness for a very uncertain and risky future that imposes some demands on governments. And I think the role of planning and trying to anticipate a wide variety of disasters and being prepared for a wide variety of disasters has clearly become more important over the last period. Nassim Taleb, who well-known gadfly and intellectual, but he had that concept of that he called anti-fragility, and that idea was that you want to have systems that are very robust and that will withstand the unexpected. and that there is a different quality of thinking and planning that is required when you're anticipating a highly uncertain future. And I think that what is happening over the last year has been very much in tune with Nassim Taleb's opinions that he was expressing a decade ago.
Amazing. A lot of your most famous work has been on how cognitive traps get in the way of people's happiness. Can you just explain what a cognitive trap is and what some of the most common examples are?
Well, an example of a cognitive trap would be that when you're thinking about a change in your life, moving to a new place and so on, there are immediate feelings that you have about the immediate consequences of the move. And then there is the long term. And in the long term, you are very likely to adapt to situations. People do not expect adaptation. That is a very fundamental rule. So you are more afraid of bad things that you will adapt to than you should be. And you are probably exaggerating the joys of good things that you will adapt to as well, because in future they will give you less joy than they do immediately. And so the neglect of adaptation and the fact that we look at distant consequences with the emotions that we have towards the very proximate consequences, that is an example of something that clearly interferes with the quality of decision making. There are many others, but this is one of them.
When I introduced you, sir, I mentioned data which found that a third of all people are suffering from depression or anxiety. What more could governments and business leaders do to address both the mental and physical challenges that life in isolation has brought on for so many people?
Well, it's clear that many people are in need of support and support groups, and those should be and mental health. To provide an infrastructure of mental health under extreme time pressure, that is, it looks very difficult. My guess would be that creating groups and support groups for people who are feeling a variety of different types of distress, that would be something that could be very useful. And I think it is happening in some places. I'm not sure how universal it is. This is really not my field.
Well, on a more personal note, perhaps, I wonder, has your research on decision-making and overcoming bias changed the way you make choices and decisions? And again, whether this past sort of year has impacted on the way that you perceive your work, as it were?
Well, I must say that for me personally, the last year, I have benefited greatly from the inability to travel. So I was working on a book on noise with a collaborator who's in France, and we used to travel and visit each other for several days each month. And we, of course, switched to spending an hour or two a day on Zoom, which turned out to be a huge benefit. And we probably would not have completed our book if we had gone on traveling as we did. So in my case, in my personal case, this has been a major benefit. I don't think that my decision making has been much affected by any of this. In general, it is difficult to change, and I do not hold myself up as an example of somebody who has learned a lot personally, or the quality of my decisions has not been very much affected by my research, I'm afraid. In general, I would say, there is more hope of using the psychology of decision making to change organizations than for individuals to change themselves. The organizations can impose procedures, organizations can impose checklists, organizations can impose a discipline on decision making, which individuals are unlikely to be successful at doing. So, when we're speaking of recommendations for changes, we're speaking actually mainly to organizations rather than to individuals.
So, in the spirit of the sort of, the next phase, the sort of post-pandemic phase, if there are key takeaways that you suggest that organizations and governments should take into 2021 and beyond, what would they be?
Well, it's going to depend, I think, on every organization is going to have to learn its own lessons. I'm not sure that there are any general lessons that will be learned, but every organization is going to have to learn what it can do, what can be done remotely and what cannot be done remotely, how to integrate new people in the organization, which I think is a major problem, how to organize training, and how to maintain coherence. There are many problems and many opportunities. People are going to have to ask themselves, and that I think is the most obvious lesson that we're learning from the pandemic, which is that there are certain things for which personal contact is not needed and others where it's as essential as ever. And for each organization, there are many lessons to be learned on which of its activities belong to one kind and which to the other.
Daniel Kahneman, I know that you are too humble to accept this from anyone, but you truly have an incredible mind and your insights are so important. Thank you for sharing your time with us. And thank you to everyone at the World Government Summit for hosting this event. I'm Becky Anderson. It has been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Professor Daniel and Becky, for really illuminating such an important topic of how to really take objective decisions.